The cruelest words are usually spoken by someone who never expects the right person to hear them. I heard Graham Calloway laugh before I saw him, and for a moment, I smiled. That sound had once meant he was actually enjoying himself, instead of carrying the weight of a $1 billion shipping empire on his shoulders. The ballroom overlooking Charleston Harbor shimmered beneath warm crystal chandeliers. Every table was dressed for our 10th wedding anniversary. Every guest held a glass, as if this night existed to celebrate promises that had survived another year. I tightened my fingers around the small navy gift box I had hidden behind my back. Inside was something simple, something only he would understand. It wasn't expensive. Graham could buy almost anything with a single phone call. I wanted to give him something money never could. I took one more step toward the private lounge where he was talking with several executives. And then I heard my husband say the sentence that stopped me where I stood. He said she still believes I wear this ring for her. The men around him laughed politely. Graham lifted his left hand just enough for the gold wedding band to catch the light. He continued with an easy smile, saying it's good for business. People trust a married man more than they trust a powerful one. Another wave of laughter rolled across the room. Someone joked that marriage was the cheapest investment a man could make. Graham nodded without hesitation and said exactly. My hand loosened around the gift box. I wasn't crying, and I wasn't angry. I simply felt as though every sound in the room had moved farther away. 10 years, 10 anniversaries, thousands of ordinary mornings. Every cup of coffee placed beside his newspaper before sunrise. Every late dinner kept warm because another meeting had run long. Every birthday remembered without reminders. Every tiny habit that quietly stitched two lives together, and in less than 10 seconds, one sentence had unraveled them inside me. None of the men noticed I was standing just beyond the half-open door. Graham didn't either. Why would he? He was looking at everyone, except the woman who had memorized the rhythm of his footsteps, long before anyone else learned the value of his signature. I looked down at the ring on my own hand. It suddenly felt heavier than it had that morning. Inside the gift box rested a vintage watch that had belonged to his father. It was carefully restored after months of searching for the right craftsman. Engraved inside the case were only 6 words. Every moment still begins with us. I had imagined him opening it after dinner. I had imagined the rare smile that softened his face when no one else was watching. I had imagined us leaving the party early and walking along the harbor, the way we used to before success filled every empty space on our calendar. Those moments disappeared before they ever happened. I closed the gift box without making a sound. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. That frightened me more than anything else. Pain that arrives quietly often stays the longest. Someone called my name from the ballroom, asking where Graham's wife had gone. I took a slow breath, straightened the sleeve of my navy dress, and smiled the same gentle smile I had worn for years. No one would see what had just broken, because nothing on the outside had changed. I walked past the ballroom instead of entering it. The music grew softer with every step, until only the echo of Graham's laughter remained behind me. Upstairs, our private study overlooked the black water stretching beyond the mansion. I unlocked the small antique safe hidden behind a framed painting, placed the anniversary gift inside, and closed the steel door with one quiet click. I rested my fingertips against the cold metal for a second before turning away. Downstairs, the celebration was only beginning. Upstairs, our anniversary had already ended. The house looked exactly the same the next morning, and that was the most dangerous part. Sunlight spilled across the marble floor. The coffee machine started at precisely 6:30, because I had programmed it years ago. The newspaper rested beside Graham's favorite chair before he came downstairs. Breakfast waited on the long walnut table overlooking Charleston Harbor. Nothing appeared broken. Only I knew that every familiar routine had suddenly become a choice, instead of an act of love. Graham walked into the kitchen already reading messages on his phone. He adjusted the cuff of his dark suit, picked up his coffee without looking, and took one quiet sip. He automatically said thank you. I smiled because that was what I had always done. He never noticed that I no longer answered "you're welcome." It was only 3 words, but they had disappeared from our mornings. He finished breakfast in less than 10 minutes, glanced at his watch, and stood. He told me he'd be late tonight because there was another meeting with the Singapore investors. I nodded once and told him to drive safely. He leaned forward and kissed my forehead with the same familiar gesture he had repeated for years. It felt more like checking a box than sharing affection. Then he walked out the front door, and the silence that followed stayed inside the house long after his car disappeared through the front gate. I carried both coffee cups into the kitchen. Mine was empty. His still held half of what I had made. I poured the cold coffee into the sink and watched the dark stream disappear. For the first time in our marriage, I realized I had memorized his habits better than he had ever learned mine. Every Tuesday, I replaced the white roses in his office because strong floral scents gave him headaches. Every Friday, I asked the chef to prepare seafood instead of steak because stressful weeks always stole his appetite. Every winter, I placed an extra scarf in the back seat of his car because he never remembered cold mornings. None of those things were written on a calendar. They simply became part of loving someone. That afternoon, I went to the museum where I worked. The quiet galleries had always helped me think. One of my coworkers smiled when she noticed I was still wearing my wedding ring. She asked if I had a wonderful anniversary. I looked at the ring for a second before answering that it was unforgettable. She laughed, assuming I meant something beautiful. I smiled politely and continued walking through the exhibition hall. Sometimes the truth sounded almost identical to a lie. Across town, Graham spent the day moving from one conference room to another. Contracts, projections, shipping routes, quarterly reports. His assistant reminded him about an interview. His attorney called about a new acquisition. His phone never stopped vibrating. Yet around lunchtime, he paused for a moment, staring at his untouched sandwich. Something felt different, although he couldn't explain what it was. He finished only half his meal before returning to work. That evening, he arrived home just after 8. Dinner was already on the table, warm but simple. We spoke about the weather, a charity event next month, and a neighbor who had renovated the house next door. The conversation was polite, comfortable, and empty. When dinner ended, I collected our plates before he could offer to help, just as I always had. The only difference was that I didn't wait for him in the living room afterward. Instead, I wished him a pleasant evening and quietly walked upstairs with a book. Graham remained alone in the family room, looking toward the staircase for a few extra seconds before turning on the television. He couldn't explain why the house suddenly felt larger than it had the day before. Neither could I. But somewhere behind the locked door of the upstairs study, an unopened anniversary gift rested inside a small antique safe, and with it remained every word I had once believed I would never need to keep to myself. The first change was so small that no one except me could have noticed it. Every evening for 10 years, I had waited by the front windows whenever Graham texted that he was on his way home. I never thought about doing it. My feet simply carried me there, while the kitchen lights reflected softly against the glass overlooking Charleston Harbor. I liked being the first person he saw after another exhausting day. 3 nights after our anniversary, his headlights swept across the driveway exactly at 7:45. I heard the front gate open. I heard the tires roll across the stone entrance. I stayed in the library and turned another page of the novel resting in my lap. The front door opened. Graham stepped inside and paused for a brief second. Usually, I greeted him before he reached the hallway. This time, only silence welcomed him home. He loosened his tie and glanced toward the staircase. He called my name in an even voice. I answered that I was in the library. He walked in carrying his briefcase. He said he thought I didn't hear him come in. I smiled gently, closed my book, and said I was reading. He nodded once, as though the explanation made perfect sense. But I noticed his eyes drift toward the front windows before he walked upstairs to change. He never mentioned it again. The following morning, another habit quietly disappeared. Every Wednesday, I slipped a handwritten note into the inside pocket of his briefcase before his driver arrived. Sometimes it was only a reminder to eat lunch. Sometimes it wished him luck before an important meeting. Sometimes it simply said that someone believed in him, even when the rest of the world only believed in his success. That Wednesday, his briefcase left the house empty. Around noon, Graham opened it during a board meeting to retrieve a folder. His hand paused inside for an extra moment. Later that afternoon, his assistant Daniel noticed him searching through the side compartments twice. Daniel asked if he lost something. Graham looked almost embarrassed by the question. He replied no after a moment, saying he must have imagined it. He closed the briefcase and continued discussing shipping contracts across the Atlantic. But for the first time in years, something unrelated to business stayed in the back of his mind. At home, I found myself moving through familiar rooms without following familiar routines. I still prepared dinner. I still kept the house warm and welcoming. I still asked about his day. I simply stopped filling every empty space before he noticed it existed. There was a strange peace in that decision. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like finally putting down a weight I had carried for too long. On Saturday evening, we attended a charity fundraiser at one of Charleston's historic hotels. Couples filled the ballroom, laughing beneath strings of warm lights, while a jazz trio played near the terrace. Graham spent most of the evening greeting business partners. I spoke with museum donors and volunteers. We smiled when photographers asked us to stand together. We looked exactly like the couple everyone admired. During dinner, one of Graham's longtime associates raised a glass. He said we always seemed so solid and asked what the secret was. Graham looked toward me with a polite smile. Before he could answer, I simply said consistency. Everyone laughed softly, assuming I meant our marriage. Only I understood I was talking about something else entirely. Consistency was what had built our life together. It was also what had quietly disappeared, one ordinary day at a time. That night, after we returned home, I removed my earrings and bracelet before standing in front of the bedroom mirror. My wedding ring caught the soft light from the bedside lamp. I stared at it for several seconds, then carefully slipped it from my finger. I didn't throw it away. I didn't hide it. I placed it inside the velvet jewelry box on my dresser, beside a pearl necklace Graham had given me years earlier. The next morning, I left the house wearing everything except that single ring. Hours later, as Graham reached across the breakfast table to pass me a cup of coffee, his eyes settled on my bare left hand. His fingers stopped moving before the cup ever reached mine. Graham didn't ask about the missing ring that morning. He looked at my hand for only a second before sliding the coffee cup toward me. But I noticed the brief hesitation in his movement. 10 years of marriage had taught me that he rarely reacted immediately to anything emotional. He stored questions the way he stored business problems, quietly waiting until he believed he had enough information to solve them. I thanked him for the coffee, finished breakfast, and left for the museum. Neither of us mentioned the empty space on my left hand. The silence between us had become strangely polite, as though we were both determined not to disturb it. That afternoon, the museum hosted a private reception for donors, and I spent hours guiding guests through a new maritime history exhibition. More than once, someone greeted me with a warm smile and asked where my husband was. I answered truthfully every time, saying he's working. It was the same answer I had given for years. The only difference was that I no longer defended it with another sentence. I no longer explained how important his responsibilities were or how much pressure he carried. I simply let the answer end where it naturally ended. Across town, Graham's day unfolded with its usual precision. Meetings began on time, contracts were signed. Investors approved another expansion along the East Coast. Daniel congratulated him on another successful quarter. But Graham's attention drifted more often than usual. When he reached for his wedding band while thinking through a difficult negotiation, he caught himself staring at it longer than he intended. The gold circle had always felt ordinary against his skin. Now it seemed to carry a question he couldn't quite name. That evening, we attended another formal event together. This one was hosted by the Charleston Business Alliance. Inside an elegant waterfront hotel, the ballroom overlooked the harbor, where cargo ships moved slowly beneath the fading light. Graham greeted executives while I spoke with community leaders and museum patrons. We moved through the room as we always had, close enough to appear inseparable, yet rarely standing beside one another for more than a few minutes. At one point, an elderly couple approached us. They had been married for more than 40 years and were well known throughout the city. The husband smiled as he admired Graham's wedding band. He told him to never take that off, saying it reminds you every day of what matters most. Graham smiled politely and thanked him. I watched his expression after the couple walked away. He instinctively touched the ring with his thumb before letting his hand fall back to his side. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the mansion had grown quiet again, Graham found me on the back terrace overlooking Charleston Harbor. A gentle breeze carried the scent of salt water across the garden. We stood side by side without speaking for several minutes. Finally, he looked toward my left hand. He calmly said he noticed I wasn't wearing my ring anymore. There was no accusation in his voice, only uncertainty. I rested my hands lightly on the stone railing and answered that I still had it. He waited for more, but none came. After another long silence, he asked if something happened. I turned toward the harbor instead of toward him and said nothing happened today. My answer was honest, yet it carried far more meaning than the words themselves revealed. Graham studied my face, as though trying to remember something just beyond his reach. For the first time in many years, he looked like a man who could solve every problem in the boardroom, but had no idea how to begin solving the one waiting quietly at home. Neither of us spoke again before going inside. As I walked toward the staircase, I heard a faint metallic sound behind me. Graham had unconsciously begun turning his own wedding band around his finger over and over, as though hoping the small circle of gold might somehow explain everything that the woman he loved was no longer willing to say. The days continued to pass with remarkable order, and somehow that order made everything feel more fragile. Nothing dramatic happened inside our home. We still shared breakfast almost every morning. We still wished each other a good day before leaving. We still sat across from one another at dinner. Anyone looking through our windows would have believed they were watching a peaceful marriage built on trust and respect. Only we knew that something invisible had quietly taken a seat between us at every table. A week after the charity gala, Graham surprised everyone in his office by canceling an evening meeting. Daniel looked up from his tablet in disbelief. He said Graham had never canceled this quarterly review before. Graham glanced toward the harbor outside his office window and told him to move it to tomorrow morning. Daniel nodded without asking another question. But after Graham left, he quietly smiled. He assumed his employer was finally making time for his marriage. Graham believed the same thing. He drove home thinking that arriving early would somehow restore a feeling he couldn't describe. When he walked through the front door just after 6 o'clock, the house greeted him with perfect silence. The dining room lights were off. The kitchen was spotless. No dinner waited beneath warm serving covers. For a brief moment, he wondered if I had forgotten the time. Then he noticed a small handwritten note resting beside the fruit bowl. It said, "Dinner is in the refrigerator. I have a museum board meeting tonight. Please don't wait for me." The words were simple, respectful, and thoughtful. They were also completely unfamiliar. Graham opened the refrigerator and found a carefully prepared meal labeled with reheating instructions. Every detail reflected the care I had always given him. The only thing missing was me. He warmed the food exactly as the note suggested and carried the plate to the dining table. The chair across from him remained empty throughout the meal. The grandfather clock in the hallway became louder with every passing minute. He looked up twice after hearing what sounded like footsteps, before remembering he was alone. By the time I returned a little after 9, he was sitting in the family room with a book open in his hands. I knew immediately he hadn't turned a single page. He asked how my meeting was. I answered that it was productive while placing my coat over the back of a chair. I asked how dinner was, and he said good. Another silence settled comfortably between us, but this one no longer felt peaceful. It felt unfinished. Graham watched me disappear upstairs before looking toward the dining room, where only one wine glass had been used that evening. The following Saturday arrived with clear skies and cool spring air. It was the exact day we had originally planned to celebrate our anniversary privately after the public reception. Months earlier, I had reserved a quiet table at a small waterfront restaurant where we had shared our first anniversary. I canceled the reservation 3 days after the party without telling him. Instead, I accepted an invitation to volunteer at a children's art workshop sponsored by the museum. Graham spent the morning finishing paperwork at his home office before remembering the date on the calendar. He walked downstairs expecting to find me getting ready. Instead, Martha, our longtime housekeeper, quietly informed him that I had left before sunrise. She gently told him that Mrs. Calloway said she would be back this evening. Graham stood in the foyer longer than necessary. He looked toward the staircase, then toward the empty driveway, as though trying to remember why the house suddenly felt unfamiliar. Later that afternoon, he wandered into the upstairs study, searching for an old property file he believed might be stored in the antique safe. When he opened the heavy steel door, folders lined one shelf in perfect order. On the shelf below rested a single navy gift box, wrapped with the same silver ribbon I had tied weeks earlier. His hand stopped inches away from it. He recognized the box immediately. He also realized, with a quiet weight settling over him, that it had never been opened. The small navy gift box remained in Graham's hands for several long seconds before he finally carried it out of the safe and placed it carefully on the desk. He didn't untie the silver ribbon immediately. Instead, he sat in the leather chair facing the large window, where the afternoon sun reflected across Charleston Harbor. For years, he had made thousands of difficult decisions in that room without hesitation. Yet, opening one gift suddenly felt impossible. He slowly loosened the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside rested the restored vintage watch that had belonged to his father. The polished silver case caught the light exactly the way his father's had when Graham was still a young man trying to prove himself. Beneath the watch lay a folded card written in my handwriting. He opened it with unusual care. "Every moment still begins with us." That was all it said. No accusation, no disappointment, no reminder about the anniversary. Only 6 words filled with a hope that now felt painfully distant. Graham closed his eyes for a moment as memories surfaced without permission. He remembered the first inexpensive watch he had worn while building his company. He remembered promising me that success would never become more important than our life together. He remembered placing our wedding rings on our hands and believing every promise he made that day. Somewhere between those memories and the present, he had quietly replaced meaning with routine. That evening, he closed his laptop before sunset for the first time in years. Daniel called twice regarding an urgent conference with overseas partners. Graham answered only once. He told Daniel to move everything to tomorrow afternoon. Daniel hesitated, saying the investors had already confirmed the schedule. Graham looked at the vintage watch resting beside his phone. He said, "Then tell them I've changed mine." It wasn't a dramatic decision. It was simply unfamiliar. He drove home without making another business call. When he entered the mansion, the smell of fresh rosemary and baked bread drifted from the kitchen. I was preparing dinner while soft music played in the background. He stood quietly at the doorway instead of heading upstairs to change clothes. I gave a polite smile and noted that he was home early. He said yes, removed his jacket, and rolled up his sleeves. Then he asked if he could help. I looked at him for a second because I honestly believed I had misunderstood the question. During 10 years of marriage, he had thanked me for countless meals, but he had almost never asked to prepare one with me. I handed him a cutting board and several tomatoes without making the moment larger than it was. We worked side by side in comfortable silence. He sliced vegetables more slowly than necessary. I stirred the soup without rushing. Neither of us spoke about the gift. Neither of us mentioned the anniversary. Yet something inside the room had shifted. During dinner, Graham left his phone on a shelf across the room instead of beside his plate. Twice he instinctively looked toward it when it vibrated. Twice he let it remain untouched. After we finished eating, I carried the plates toward the sink, as I always had. Before I reached the counter, he gently took them from my hands. He said he could do these since I cooked. I watched him fill the sink with warm water while carefully stacking each plate. His movements were awkward, almost uncertain, but they were sincere. There was no audience to impress, no business advantage to gain. Only a quiet choice made inside an ordinary kitchen. Later that night, I found him standing alone on the back terrace wearing his father's restored watch. He wasn't checking the time. He simply rested his fingers against the worn silver case, as though trying to understand why a forgotten family heirloom had reminded him of something far more valuable. Inside the house, the dining table had already been cleared, but for the first evening in many weeks, 2 coffee cups remained side by side instead of only one. The real test arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, disguised as another ordinary day. Graham's calendar had been planned for weeks around the final negotiation of a shipping contract that would expand his company into 2 additional international ports. Every executive on his leadership team knew the meeting could influence the next decade of the business. Daniel arrived before 8, carrying 3 folders and a fresh schedule. He told Graham the board members were already in the conference room. Graham adjusted the restored watch on his wrist before reaching for his jacket. As he slipped it on, a small white envelope resting beside his briefcase caught his attention. My handwriting covered only his name. Inside was a simple invitation from the museum. The annual maritime exhibition I had spent almost a year organizing would open to the public that evening. At the bottom of the card, I had written only one sentence. I wrote, "No pressure. I simply wanted you to know where I'll be." There was no request, no reminder, no expectation. Graham folded the invitation and placed it carefully inside his wallet. Throughout the morning, he tried to focus on financial projections, shipping routes, and legal agreements. Yet, every time the conversation paused, his hand drifted toward the folded card. Around noon, Daniel quietly reminded everyone that the evening presentation with the overseas investors had been confirmed for 6 o'clock sharp. Graham looked at the digital clock on the conference room wall. The museum exhibition would begin at the exact same time. Months earlier, he wouldn't have hesitated. Business always came first because he believed providing for our future was the purest form of love. Today, the decision no longer felt simple. One executive noticed his silence and asked if everything was all right. Graham nodded automatically, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the room at people waiting for instructions. For years, they had admired him because he never allowed personal matters to interfere with work. He suddenly wondered whether they had also learned that lesson from him at home. He stood, closed the presentation folder, and spoke with the same calm voice he used during every important negotiation. He told Daniel that he would lead the meeting tonight. The room became completely still. Daniel blinked in surprise and said the investor specifically requested him. Graham gave a small, respectful smile. He said to tell them he trusts his team. He added that if he had built this company correctly, it shouldn't depend on one man being in one room every evening. No one argued after that. Just before 6 o'clock, he walked quietly into the museum instead of the downtown office tower. The entrance hall buzzed with visitors, local officials, and donors admiring the exhibits. I was speaking with a group near the restored lighthouse display when I glanced toward the back of the room. Graham stood alone beside the doorway, still wearing his dark suit from work. He had arrived early enough that no one had announced the event yet. He didn't wave. He didn't interrupt. He simply remained there, listening while I spoke about preserving the stories behind every artifact. Because history loses its meaning when people stop remembering why something mattered in the first place. Our eyes met across the room for only a moment. I continued my presentation exactly as planned. Afterward, guests surrounded me with questions and congratulations. Graham waited patiently until the crowd slowly dispersed. He quietly said my exhibition was remarkable. I thanked him for coming. He looked around the gallery, filled with families, children, and elderly couples reading handwritten letters displayed beneath glass. He admitted that he almost missed this. I gently answered that he almost did. Neither of us said anything more. We walked through the exhibition side by side in unhurried silence, stopping together before each display case. And for the first time in many months, the distance between us was no longer measured by the space that separated our footsteps, but by the choices that had finally begun to change. The museum had almost emptied by the time the last guests drifted toward the exit. Volunteers folded brochures, security guards dimmed the lights in the outer galleries, and the quiet echo of footsteps slowly replaced the conversations that had filled the building all evening. Graham and I remained behind, walking through the exhibition without feeling the need to fill every silence. The restored watch rested on his wrist. I noticed it immediately, but I chose not to mention it. Some changes deserved room to breathe before they were acknowledged. We stopped in front of an old glass display containing handwritten letters exchanged between sailors and their families more than a century ago. Many of the pages had faded with time, yet every carefully chosen word remained readable. Graham studied one letter longer than the others. He quietly said they wrote knowing it might take months before anyone answered, yet they still believed every word mattered. I looked at the delicate handwriting beneath the glass. I answered that when people believe something is valuable, they protect it. He lowered his eyes and added, even when nobody else sees them doing it. For a moment, neither of us moved. When we returned home that evening, the mansion felt different. Not because anything inside had changed, but because neither of us rushed toward separate rooms. Graham followed me into the living room instead of disappearing into his office. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking Charleston Harbor, while a single lamp filled the room with warm light. Without saying anything, I walked upstairs and returned carrying a medium-sized leather journal with worn edges. I placed it gently on the coffee table between us. Graham looked at it with quiet curiosity. He asked what it was. I told him to open it. He carefully lifted the cover. The first page held a photograph from our wedding day. We were both smiling at one another instead of at the camera. Beneath the picture, I had written the date in one sentence. He looked at me as though time had stopped. Graham slowly turned the next page. There was another photograph, this one from our first anniversary, followed by a handwritten memory about the tiny seafood restaurant where we celebrated because we couldn't afford anything more expensive. The next page described the first house we bought together. Another remembered the night we sat on the floor eating takeout because our furniture hadn't arrived yet. Every anniversary, every birthday, every small victory, every disappointment we survived together. 10 years filled the journal, one page at a time. Graham continued turning the pages in complete silence. Near the end, he found a folded receipt from the watch restoration and the original sketch for the engraving hidden inside it. Tucked inside those papers rested another small envelope. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple note written several weeks before our anniversary. It said I never wanted another expensive gift. I only hoped one day we would treasure the same promises again. Graham closed the journal, but kept both hands resting on its cover. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't explain the pressure of business or the responsibilities that had consumed his attention. Those explanations suddenly felt too small for what he finally understood. He looked at me with eyes that no longer searched for an easy answer. He softly said he thought he was protecting our future. Somewhere along the way, he stopped protecting what gave that future meaning. I held his gaze without speaking. There was nothing I could add that would make the moment more honest. After another long silence, Graham slowly removed his wedding band and placed it on top of the journal. My heartbeat paused for an instant, not because I believed he was giving up, but because I realized he was seeing it for the first time. He rested his fingertips against the ring. He said that for years he believed this was only a symbol. Tonight, he realized it was supposed to remind him how he should live every ordinary day. Outside, the rain continued falling across the harbor. But inside our home, the silence no longer felt empty. It finally sounded like two people listening to the truth at the same time. Morning arrived quietly over Charleston Harbor. Golden sunlight stretched across the water and slipped through the tall windows of our home, touching the dining table where two coffee cups waited side by side. For the first time in many weeks, neither of us rushed to fill the silence with explanations. Some truths had already been spoken. The rest would have to be proven one ordinary day at a time. Graham came downstairs, wearing a light blue shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. The restored watch remained on his wrist. He stopped beside the kitchen counter, picked up the coffee pot before I reached for it, and filled both cups without saying a word. Then he smiled. Not the confident smile that belonged in boardrooms, but the smaller one I hadn't seen in years. He asked if I wanted cream. I nodded once. He remembered exactly how much. It was a tiny detail. Yet, after everything that had happened, it felt larger than any expensive gift he had ever given me. Later that morning, his phone rang repeatedly with calls from executives preparing another international expansion. Graham answered each one calmly, delegated responsibilities, and ended every conversation on time. When the final call ended, he closed the phone and left it on the hallway table instead of carrying it through the house. That simple decision reminded me of something I had once believed was gone forever. Presence, not perfection. During the following weeks, his changes continued with remarkable consistency. He came home when he promised he would. He asked about the museum before talking about business. He listened without interrupting. He noticed when fresh flowers appeared on the dining table. He thanked Martha by name instead of walking past her while reading emails. He even learned how to prepare Sunday breakfast. Although the pancakes came out uneven and the bacon was slightly overcooked, we laughed together for the first time in what felt like years. It wasn't because the breakfast was perfect. It was because neither of us cared that it wasn't. One Saturday afternoon, we walked along the harbor where we had spent countless evenings before success had rewritten our schedules. Families pushed strollers along the waterfront. Sailboats drifted across the calm water. The air smelled of salt and spring flowers. Graham slowed his pace until we were walking side by side instead of hurrying toward another destination. Halfway down the promenade, he stopped near a wooden bench overlooking the marina. Without saying anything, he reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed his wedding band. My heart tightened for only a moment before he held out his other hand. Resting on his open palm was my ring, polished until it reflected the afternoon sun. He quietly said he asked the jeweler to clean it. Not because it needed to look new, but because he wanted to remember that promises deserve care too. He didn't ask me to put it on. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply waited. I looked at the ring for several long seconds before taking it gently into my hand. The gold felt familiar. So did the silence between us. This silence no longer carried distance. It carried patience. I slipped the ring back onto my finger because I believed the man standing beside me had earned another chance, through the choices he continued to make every day, not through the words he wished he had never spoken. Graham looked down at our hands, then quietly placed his own ring back where it belonged. As we continued walking, our fingers brushed together once, then naturally intertwined without either of us thinking about it. No applause followed. No dramatic music marked the moment. Only the steady sound of waves meeting the shore while the evening light settled across Charleston Harbor. I realized then that love had never lived inside the rings we wore. It had always lived inside the daily decisions we made after putting them on. And this time, neither of us intended to forget that.